Welcome back to the 2020 Kentucky Bourbon Festival. I'm Steve Coombs, your host for this event and many others. Tonight's episode starts with bottle and bond. In fact, why bottle and bond? Why we use this crazy term on whiskeys that are 4 years old from one distillery in one distilling season and bottled at 100 proof. And there's even deeper regulations that we'll talk about later. Why that's important to your palate and to your pocketbook, but sometimes even to your persona, because people get a little bit of a ego rush out of having a bottle and bond bottle these days. And to explain why, my guests this evening are experts and descendants of people that started that in the whole whiskey discussion back in 1897. To my far left is Bernie Lubbers, Global Whiskey Ambassador for Heaven Hill, and Beau Beckman is the single barrel program director at Buffalo Trace. He's the guy that you're mad at when you can't get in for a single barrel. Is that right, Beau?
I guess, unfortunately.
You got big shoulders. You can take it.
I'll be mad at the people that didn't make enough.
That's right. Push that off onto Harlan. Right. Bernie, I want to start with you because you've got such an experience with this, and to some degree get a little bit of credit for pushing bottle and bond whiskeys back onto the scene. So answer the big question. Why do we care about bottle and bond?
Well, I can tell you why I care. I remember seeing that word on bottles as a kid, going to stores and seeing it bonded on there.
And your dad was an old Fitzgerald bonded fan, right?
My dad was a Heaven Hill 6-year 90 fan, which is still around. He was an all-day drinker, so he needed a little lighter proof, I think. But I love that bonded. Just seeing that word was something to me. And I asked my dad, I said, "What's bonded mean?" And he looked, and he got a little serious. He goes, "Well, that's the good stuff." And I said, "Well, what makes the good stuff?" He goes, "Well, it's 100 proof." Now, that's about as far as he could go. And he also said, it's got that green tax strip on it. So everything else had a red tax strip around the top. In green, you could always tell the bottle and bonds in the store because you could just look at the tops of the bottles and it was all green, the tax stamp.
So he even understood product recognition at that point, or product distinguished.
Yeah, he worked for a brewery. So Fall City Brewing Company is where he worked for 45 years. So he knew all that kind of stuff. But he drank one beer and then he switched to bourbon. That was it, every day. So, so I was like, oh, I got to know about this bottle and bond. It's the good stuff, right? My dad said it was the good stuff. And so that just kind of stuck in my head. And then once I started, as got legal drinking age and got around, and you try to find your own bourbon, right? There was your mom's bourbon, your dad's bourbon, but it's a little rite of passage when it's your bourbon, right? And I was working, I was a comedian at the time, and I was working up in northern Ohio, in Parma, just outside of Cleveland. And this club had this bourbon that, had the orange label, and it was Old Granddad bonded. And I was like, oh, give me one of those. And then I was like, oh man, I just love this. And that was my first favorite bourbon. And then I started, when I got into the business, I was like, why is nobody talking about bottle and bond? And because it was just, bottle and bonds, Beau will tell you, it will never sell 1 million cases a year. The restrictions on it are so much, one distilling season and that, it's never gonna be, so all these companies that are owned by these, by Wall Street and stockholders, they're not looking for a brand that sells 100,000 cases. They're looking for a brand that sells 1 million cases. But of course, I'm always kind of rooting for that underdog, right? So and thank God I ended up at Heaven Hill Distillery, where we bottle more bottle and bonds than any other distillery, and we're family owned, as you all are too. And our owner's like, we want to sell every barrel. So he doesn't really. Obviously, he cares if it sells 1 million cases. We're in the bourbon business, not the bourbon charity. But every barrel's a sale, and so it's cool.
I assume with you all, it's not like us. It's not about quarterly earnings. It's all long term.
Absolutely,
and that helps being privately owned.
And we don't even know what our quarterly earnings.
Yeah, I
guess we're doing good. Right?
And speaking of long term, let's talk about your connection to this man who played a vital role in the establishment of the bottle and bond law.
Yeah. So it's actually interesting. Before Colonel E.H. Taylor was at what is now Buffalo Trace Distillery, about 100 years before him was Commodore Richard Taylor. And Commodore Richard Taylor was brought in to build the locks on the Kentucky River.
Oh, wow.
So about 100 years later is when E.H. Taylor came and bought what was basically a mom and pop distillery resurrected it by putting all sorts of money into it and going bankrupt doing it. Part of the money he was spending was getting
We
that.
see how history repeats itself in that vein these days.
Well, yeah, so part of what he was getting focused on was the 1897 Bottle and Bond Act. He really championed getting that through, and it was the first Consumer Protection Act. But what's interesting was it was kind of a mutual beneficial relationship with the government, because the government is having trouble collecting tax. So the revenuers are always going in there trying to figure out how we're going to make sure we get all the tax money from this distillery we need. And on the other side, you have E.H. Taylor complaining about imitation whiskey. So all these folks that are, some are rectifiers, they're doing it the right way and the wrong way.
Tell them what a rectifier is.
So a rectifier is someone that would go to different distilleries, buy barrels, make their own blends. So a lot of rectifiers do amazing jobs. And then there are some people that, especially back then, you had no idea what they're putting in that bottle. And so the consumer-facing side of that was you didn't know what you're buying.
It could be some nasty stuff going on.
It could be some nasty stuff. You hear things of tobacco for coloring, all sorts of stuff you don't want to touch.
I always joke, think about that first party you ever threw, right? And you thought, I'll just get a bottle of Everclear, right? And
make
then
a
I'll
jungle
just
juice.
add juice to it, and that's kind of what they were doing.
Yeah.
They were just kind of,
Yeah, I picture it's the
adding
suicide
things
at
to
the-
neutral grain spirits, right? That's basically what we were all doing.
So talk about the drum he had to beat with, I think state legislators and then eventually the federal legislators to say this is a real deal. We need to have this consumer protection thing intact, and we're going to do the hard work of this to really back what we're saying, that this is quality whiskey.
I think what was on the other side, what was in it for the government was, look, we're going to give you much better access to our books. Because if you're going to be able to put bottle and bond on this, you're going to have to know what is at a distillery, how long was there, when we produced it. And before that, it was always Uncle Sam's going to make some tax around alcohol, and then the distilleries, even the revenuers, are going to figure out how to circumvent it. So this was kind of both sides came together and said, we want to protect the consumers. Well, we want your tax money. So let's figure out how to make this work.
I didn't know that side.
And it was also a way to delay taxes at the very beginning.
Okay, now that's a great point. Start with the basics and then get to that, because that is an essential part of it.
Well, as Beau was saying, you had these people that were essentially making whiskey flavored vodka by adding safe and sometimes unsafe ingredients. So it was a big deal. You had to, we wanted to protect the consumer for that. And when they were lobbying for it, when Colonel E.H. Taylor and I believe Ezra Brooks and several other distillers, not every distiller was behind this, by the way. I mean, and you can understand it. We want the government to control us more. I mean, who says that, right? So it was understandably, it was mixed feelings about it. But for the government side too, they already had agents at the distilleries living on the distilleries. It wasn't like they had to put all this into place. The infrastructure was there. So they had, until I believe the late 60s, early 70s, they had agents living at the distilleries. Every distillery had it. So those people, because they had to go in and check and they were
they had the keys to the warehouse.
Keys to the warehouse. And so they were already there. It wasn't a huge leap. Plus, there was some overproduction that was happening, and back then you had to pay the tax as soon as it came off the still. Well, putting it in bond, it was like putting it on the shelf for a while, and you only had to pay tax on that whiskey when you brought it out of bond. And the bonding period
4 years tax deferred at that point.
They had the bonding period was lengthened and shortened over time. So the government wants their money. They don't want the bonding period to be 16 years, 20 years. So they went, that was changing over time. But yeah, it was a good way to defer your taxes.
So let's see if I know them all. A bonded product has to be the product of one of two distilling seasons each year, January to June.
That's the spring season.
That's right, July to December.
The fall season.
It has to be aged at least 4 years, according to, if it's a bourbon, it will be the bourbon rules. Other American whiskey or rye can be those rules. Bottle at no more than 100 proof.
Exactly 100 proof.
That's right. Kept in a government bonded warehouse, which they all are now, right? Technically.
Technically, they are, yes.
Did I miss anything?
Yeah. A few
Go
things.
on, fill it
This is
in.
when you get pretty.
This is when
granular.
we let the experts
You go in a
talk.
different order than I do. So from the same distillery, the
That's
same
right.
distilling season, the same distiller.
Right.
And then pure water only to reduce it to exactly 100 degrees of proof. So none of that coffee or tea or battery acid or things like that can be. So only pure water to be added to it. Then you have to put the real name of the distillery on the package. That's pretty cool. But we all, Sazerac owns many different names. Heaven Hill owns many different names. Heaven Hill, Evan Williams, Elijah Craig, and that's still our real name. But you have to put the distinctive distillery plant number. So that's the DSP, Distilled Spirits Plant Number. So which are all DSP that you put on your E.H. Taylor?
113.
So it says DSP and KY, because you're in Kentucky, and 113. So I know now, if I know how to read a label, and now we have the Google, we didn't have the Google back then, but you can put, DSP KY 113 and you all come up. Ours is DSP KY 1, because we're the best. That's my joke. It's my joke, but it just happens to be what Mr. Bernheim chose to have. And before that, every county had a DSP KY1. That was just about the state now. But anyway, so that's our unique number, DSP KY1. Then our bottling plant is right here in Bardstown, which is different than our distillery in Louisville, and that's DSP KY31. So it gets so down to brass tacks that I know exactly who made it. I know exactly who bottled it. I know a minimum of 4 years old. I know it's pure. I'm guaranteed a good age and a good strength. That's pretty cool in 1897.
And if
pretty
you think
cool
about
today.
that today, that's what everybody wants is to know
Yeah.
every single thing
Yeah,
about what
it's
they
like
consume.
it played into the hands of the bourbon nerd.
Yeah,
And
right.
Totally.
It really
all
was
that,
way
all
ahead
that
of its
cool
time.
stuff.
I mean,
Any stories before we move on to kind of the modern part? Any fun stories about you're a sixth generation descendant of Colonel E.H. Taylor, right?
yeah, great-grandfather's great-grandfather. So yeah, about what
That's
I
kind of like squaring or cubing
Yeah.
a number, isn't it?
Yeah, he didn't get to share any information with me. Though, so he was actually born February 12th, 1830, and then my grandfather was born February 12th, 1930. So it's kind of interesting is with Commodore Richard Taylor, who was there to build the locks on the Kentucky distillery. 100 years later, late 1800s, early 1900s is when E.H. Taylor was there. And then 100 years later is when I was hired. So I say about every 100 years we send a tailor to the distillery to check on things.
Oh, that's kind of cool. Very cool. So,
A deck that will last for generations. An engine rebuilt to run like new. A car so clean you almost don't want to get it dirty again. Almost. Quality means something. Big job or small, you make sure things get done right. It's not a competition. It's just that you're not willing to settle. Not in your work, not in your hobbies, and never with your bourbon. Evan Williams, bourbon done right.
The time has come to welcome visitors back to Buffalo Trace Distillery. We've taken steps to address your health, safety, and comfort when you come see us. Reservations are required, and there are new safeguards in place, like temperature checks, face masks, a limit on group size, contact information, and of course, social distancing. Visit us online or call us to find out more. Buffalo Trace Distillery is a safe haven for your next bourbon experience. See you soon.
so talk about pricing. I mean, we have a range here of roughly 20 to, this is a single barrel, so that's going to be kind of exclusive. What is the MSRP?
50 to 60.
Okay, so that's still not bad at all for a seriously regulated, fully disclosed whiskey.
Absolutely.
So give your little rule of thumb about it. You go in with a shopping cart and you say you got $100. I think this is a great illustration of the quality of these and the price points of these whiskeys.
I tell people, here, you take your own $100 bill, I'll take a $100 bill, and we'll go into a liquor store, and when I come out, my cart is going to be fuller than your cart, and I think probably better whiskey. And that's my challenge.
And they're going to be full of bottle and bonds, right?
There's going to be a lot of them in there.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because most of them were forgotten. They were under. A lot of ours are under $20, and we only have a couple that are over 30. It was the mainstay of a distillery. First of all, it took a long time. 1897, it was passed, and then you had to tell people what bottle and bond was. It's a cool thing, Beau.
Yeah.
We're teaching it now, right? Which I'm glad, because I don't have a job if I don't have to teach people anything. So I don't want anybody to know everything, okay? So stay ignorant to some facts, because I need a job, right? So they had to teach it. And then of course, it was just like the Affordable Care Act, right? You know, the Affordable Care Act comes out and it's law, and people are like, well, when the Bottle and Bond Act came out, there was a lot of people wanted to strike it down, right? The rectifiers didn't like it because they weren't the product of one distillery. They were adding things to it, so they wanted to keep that gig going, right? So they wanted to strike that down. And people said, well, how can that happen? It's law. Well, just like the Affordable Care Act, people wanted to strike it down even after it's law. So that was happening there. And so then Taft makes a decision, and this is one of the biggest, you know, after that watershed moment for American spirits, because Bottle and Bond can be any domestic distilled spirits, not just whiskey, but most of it is. Then you had the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So, you know, it tells the ingredients on things, and also defined whiskey, further defined whiskey. And so you had these, so that was a big deal. And so as it goes on, you had to tell people would advertise Bottle and Bond, or under the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, our product's more pure. You should buy our product because it's more pure. And you know who made it. So you had to teach people. And then, of course, we had Prohibition. And then it all doesn't go away, though.
Yeah.
But it doesn't go away. And so the industry standard of the good stuff, like my dad who saw it, was Bottle and Bond. Then during Prohibition, and you all have a great display at your distillery of the medicinal boxes and bottles, because that's the only whiskey that you could get for medicinal purposes was Bottle and Bond.
I didn't know that.
I think we did 6 million pints through Prohibition.
Yeah. I mean,
a lot of sick people in Prohibition.
I just love looking at that wall, because it's just, you know, I love Bottle and Bond, and to see that history. And then after Prohibition, you weren't really taken seriously unless you had a Bottle and Bond. And then, like, we made our barrel number 1 December 13th, 1935. We weren't coming out with the first bourbon until December 14th, 1939. So we had to wait 4 years because it was what people expected. You weren't taken seriously unless you had a Bottle and Bond. So that's how important it was. And then people knew. And then, of course, all the history happened to the whole industry, as Max Shapiro says, we almost went to the great liquor store in the sky. So Bottle and Bonds went away, and then whiskey almost went away. But that's a whole nother story. But that's how important Bottle and Bond is and was.
So, if I'm not mistaken, this is the only Sazerac product, the E.H. Taylor, that is Bottle and Bond. Am I correct? Or
We have 1792 is also Bottle and Bond.
That's
There's
right.
a Bottle and Bond expression of that.
Yellowneck, right?
Yep.
It was a weird illustration, was it not? Yellowneck, but that's the neck on the bottle. It's about as skinny
defining
as mine.
characteristic. I mean, there's a lineup of 1792, so it's easier to color code them.
Is that a pain in the neck to do, to manage a Bottle and Bond whiskey all the way through, or has it just been streamlined now?
I mean, on our end, it's not necessarily. It's you have to do some extra work to pick the barrels to make sure you're picking barrels from the same lot. You know, especially when you're doing like a small batch variety, you have to be a little extra careful.
Yeah, so you can't have barrels from June into July. That's
right.
a different season.
That's
so
right.
That gets. But this is. I always joke that these are barriers to entry for your competitors, right? And what's a barrier to entry to a competitor? That it's an everyday thing for you. It makes it. That's why you don't see. You know. That's why it's hard to get into this. It should be hard to get into this industry.
Right.
But that's another thing that makes it hard. And what makes people tear their hair out. We just go every day and go, it's one of those deals. I mean, a barrel's 530 pounds. That's pretty hard to put up in. You deal with that.
Yeah. I mean, even just bottling a single barrel in general is a lot of work.
Yeah, I don't think people know that.
Yeah. I love that. That's a great point. Is the things that we do that are tough are barriers to entry. I mean, but it's kind of normal. Yeah.
But we're also seeing now a lot of craft distillers putting out Bottle and Bond issues. Is that manageable because it's a smaller amount of inventory, I guess, to deal with?
So far, I would imagine.
A handful of barrels.
Yeah, but you think about it, though. You think about, like, Wilderness Trail was one of the first, I think, to really come out with and they waited. That's what they wanted to come out with first.
Just like Evan
And
Hillman.
I was talking to Pat and them, and it's like, how cool is that? But then again, they have another business that they do. They didn't have to bring it out early.
No.
And so they had the ability to wait, because when you wait to sell it, that's a lot of money to wait. 4 years is a long time to not have revenue coming in. So, but they thought it was important enough to wait till that. And then I think a lot of people started following suit after that, saying we can do that too. I mean, they weren't the very, very first, but still, it is, you're so tempted to come out with a 6-month-old product, or a 1-year-old product, or a 2-year-old product.
Just to get some revenue.
You got to.
Yeah.
But to have that commitment, and then they're only making 1 to 3 barrels a day. How many barrels do they have from 6 months?
Yeah.
Do the math. It's not that many, you know. So, are you national? Are you distributed just in 1 state or 2 states? I mean, there is the business side of this.
And you have to pick, I mean, the barrels that you put into that batch. If you don't have a lot of, you know, if you only have 100 barrels to pick from, you might want it to go further, bottle more, but at the same time, then you're going to start sacrificing quality if you just put in random barrels from it. So it's kind of a balance.
So it sounds like you have to be paying attention at every step of inventory.
Oh,
I mean,
If you
and I'm
want to
sure
do
the
it
government
right.
wants you to as well.
Yeah.
oh, absolutely. I mean,
Put that different tax
any
structure.
successful distillery manages their inventory, their barrel inventory well.
All right, so I want to talk lastly about the role that Bottle and Bond whiskeys played in the cocktail revival that has also fueled this bourbon boom. Rittenhouse Rye is a classic example.
Rittenhouse Rye put us on the map when it came to cocktail bars and restaurants. I still think we're a very small little distillery, even though I call Heaven Hill the Reno, Nevada of distilleries. We're the biggest little distillery in the world, right? Because when I started in 2012, we only had 42 salespeople covering the entire United States. That's not 1 per state. You know? And so they just called on liquor stores. That's all they had time to do. Now we have 97, which is still pretty small compared to major distilleries. And so we have people that are dedicated to calling on bars and restaurants and cocktail bars, because it was the bar managers and owners that were ordering Rittenhouse Rye. We weren't selling it to them. We didn't call on them. They said, we need a cocktail made from a whiskey or a spirit that stands up in the cocktail even after you add sweet vermouth and bitters and stir it with ice, and it's got to stand up so an 80 to 90 proof product disappears in the Manhattan or the cocktail. But the 100 proof, that base spirit stands up. And they didn't need a 10, 12-year-old whiskey to make a cocktail with. You enjoy those neat, or maybe a cube of ice or a little bit, but you need a good base spirit. So a 4-year-old product that's Bottle and Bond rose it. They said, that's what we want. And that put us on the map. And that's why in 2012, we launched a bourbon variety, which we had several. J.W. Dant, J.T.S. Brown, T.W. Samuels, but none, only in 1 little market do we have, and it was a horrible little, I love it, ugly label. Had a little log cabin on it, and green. It was terrible. It's so terrible. It was beautiful. Right? And then we decided, if we can't take all 5 of these regional little, T.W. Samuels, J.W. Dants. You got to pick one. And so we picked the number 2 selling bourbon in the world, and then we launched Evan Williams Bottle and Bond in 2012, and now it's the biggest selling Bottle and Bond, which is kind of an oxymoron because it's never going to be a huge seller, but but it is coveted. So I call Evan Williams Bourbon the Rittenhouse of bourbon. So if you're looking for a nice
Made
bourbon,
by the Reno
not a rye
distillery,
and they would use your rye, but it's the cost prohibitive because there's so little of it, and it's more of a higher end for that. But you all have a great rye that cocktail bars love all over the world.
Bottom line is, if you're making cocktails, Bottle and Bond whiskeys are fantastic in those, just as you said, because of the spice and the backbone and the oomph from 100 horsepower. 100 horsepower, 100 proof.
That's right. And of course, we make a corn whiskey, Mellow Corn, one of my favorite underrated whiskeys out there.
Also Bottle and Bond,
which is I believe the only. There could be a couple craft out there making a Bottle and Bond corn whiskey, but it's under $15. It's hard to beat.
Guys, Bernie, Beau, thanks again so much for being with us to talk about Bottle and Bond whiskeys.
It's my favorite topic.
It is. You can tell you get excited about it, right?
Got my shirt on, my Stay Bonded shirt. So I should stay
Just in
bonded.
case you forgot, he's got a tattoo under here, but you'll have to see that on Facebook. Thanks again for being with us and talking about these whiskeys. Make your cocktails from these. Meantime, sit with us, sip with us, and we'll be back with more episodes right after this.